So today we have a really wonderful tour, sort of a behind-the-scenes tour of the new Orchid House here at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and I'm being joined by Nick Snakenberg right here, who is the curator of tropical collections, which would include the orchids.
Yep.
This is a wonderful place. Now tell me, you've got all new facilities here. How is it different than the old greenhouse?
Well, in our old facilities, we had about 4,000 square feet, all in one greenhouse. And with our new facilities, we have a little smaller footprint, but we have 3 different growing environments. So plants that like it warm can be in the warmer house, plants that like it cool can be in the cooler house, and they're all just happier being in environments that more closely replicate what they'd find in nature.
In nature. Okay, well that makes sense, and we've got a bunch of beautiful plants blooming here. This happens to be the glass windows here that look out onto the Orangery.
Yeah, it's another added benefit of our new facilities is that while all these behind-the-scenes collections used to be hidden from our visitors, our everyday visitor now can walk right up to the window and look into our collection greenhouses and see what's in bloom any day of the week. And we try to rotate things up to the front window so people can enjoy them more close up.
It looks like they're doing really well. Nick and I were walking through the orchids, and I noticed that over the years, orchids have become much more commonplace on the market. You see them at big box stores, at grocery stores, at the garden centers. It's not just a rich man's hobby anymore.
Yeah, I mean, every week when I walk into the grocery store, there's a new batch of orchids for sale, and so they become much more available for the common man, and the hobby has really exploded and taken off. One of the plants you'll see almost any garden center or box store, the Phalaenopsis. It's a great plant for beginners. Moth orchids. It blooms for months at a time, which if you go all that work to get it to bloom, it's nice to have that length of reward.
Well, and each flower will last quite a few weeks, which is strange because they look so delicate, but they're so durable.
Right. Yeah, another good plant for beginners is the Paphiopedilum, a slipper orchid. Most orchids are epiphytic, like the ones behind me here, growing on tree limbs, but the Paphiopedilums are terrestrial. They grow in the ground.
So they have a different way you grow them and a different mix you pot them in.
Exactly, and an entirely different root system, more fibrous roots as opposed to some of the other plants. Colorado has a number of native orchids. Over 20 different orchid species grow wild in Colorado.
Here in Colorado.
A lot of people think of them as purely tropical plants, but they grow in every environment except Antarctica.
Yeah.
So again, this is a nice beginner plant because it's a little more resilient to the low humidity conditions that we have in Colorado. And like the Phalaenopsis, they like temperatures similar to what we like in the home. So we don't have to go to great lengths to provide any special environment.
Well, now some of these orchids you would need to do that with that you've got growing. Let's move on down, and there's a couple of other things I'd like for people to see that you've got growing here. Like we were talking about the common names, the moth orchid and the lady slipper orchid. There's others out there like this Cockle-Shell orchid.
Yeah, this is Encyclia cochleata. Some people call it the Cockle-Shell orchid. I've heard people call it an octopus. It looks like a little octopus.
That's true too, yeah.
And this is another great one to grow in the home. This is actually the first plant that I grew, kind of got me started on orchids.
Oh, that's nice.
Many, many years ago. It's an epiphyte, but we've adapted that to grow in a pot.
But what would it look like on a mount, the way it would normally grow in nature?
This is a close relative to that same plant, and you can see we've put it on a piece of cork bark, and the roots have just grabbed right hold.
These are all roots right here.
Yep, and they grab right hold of the substrate, and actually takes great effort to pull these off, so they can hold on in hurricanes and windstorms and
monkeys jumping on them and
exactly,
all sorts of things.
So
yeah,
they're not phased.
Which just
a
goes
bit.
to prove they're very durable plants. People are scared of orchids, but I don't think they should be. They're one of the more durable plants I've ever grown. And if you just go to a little bit of extra effort in the house where you're going to be growing the orchids, I wouldn't scatter them all over the house. I'd create an area where you want to grow your orchids and increase the humidity just in that spot.
Exactly. I think a mistake that a lot of orchid people make is that they find a plant that they're in love with, they see a plant they're in love with, and they buy it and try to grow it, not knowing if they can provide the proper conditions. So
true.
I think it's better to know what conditions you have or what conditions you're willing to provide and choose orchids based on that.
What would you recommend as far as some basic in-home conditions for orchids for something like this?
Well, these are two great beginner plants, and I think one of the reasons, aside from them liking the same conditions we have in our home, is that they're a little more forgiving about watering and light and temperature. Low light for both of these. So
no direct sun?
No direct sun on these. The leaves will sunburn, and once it's sunburned, it's kind of there permanently. So indirect light to low light, which most of us can provide, they're a little more tolerant of our lower humidity conditions, but it's never a bad idea to provide a little extra humidity by grouping your plants together or put it in an evaporative tray underneath is always helpful as well. And then once you've caught the bug and have learned how to master, the beginner plants, then you can expand into the more unusual and the harder to acquire. And there's no end to the hobby. There's 25,000 some different naturally occurring species and hundreds of thousands of hybrids. So there's always something new to learn and something new to discover. So it's a fantastic hobby.
You'll be stuck with orchids for life, and that's not such a bad thing, is it?
It's given me a career.
That's true, that's true. Well, thank you, Nick. We really appreciate this behind-the-scenes tour of the greenhouse here. I hope you all enjoyed it. Next, we're going to go out to the consulate, and MJ will meet us there and talk about hardscaping.